Well, it's the new year. And for many people, the new year is one of the most frightening times of all. The holidays themselves are often frightening. Sometimes it's loneliness, sometimes it's bad memories, sometimes it's the loss of a loved one in the past year. There are any number of different reasons. But many times it's what does the new year bring? This was a tough year this past year. And our hope certainly is that 2022 will be better, but there are many who think that we have dropped into a time where we go from bad things to maybe worse things. And so here are a few things to worry about in 2022. A meteor hitting the Earth. There is one film out right now that is all about a meteor hitting the Earth. And the interesting thing about it is something of a comedy. Is that nobody wants to do anything. Nobody believes it's really going to happen. We just go on with life as it is. Nuclear war with Iran. Middle Eastern war generally. Climate change causing killer hurricanes, tornadoes, fires, and floods. Maybe we'll have a war with Russia, a war with China over Taiwan. Christians being arrested for their faith, even here in America, but certainly in other countries. Or perhaps the fear is being canceled by Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, someone else. Well, the big fear, of course, is getting COVID. And having just had it, I can tell you it is nothing to fear, particularly Omicron. And this is the one you want to get. It acts more like a vaccine. Um, it's basically a bad cold, but having been caused by a spike protein and actually several other proteins. There are 29 proteins involved, as best I know. But you can turn on the news and you'll be able to see your fears carefully laid out and displayed and stoked, and perhaps this very evening you will be unable to sleep thinking about the things that are going to happen in the coming year. There are plenty of people who would like to make you afraid. Fear sells. Many people look forward to the new year, but for others, it is indeed frightening. And there is this palpable and very real fear that the future will not be as good as the past. For some, it's just, I'm getting older. I'm getting older, and there's a realization that I have fewer years to live than the years that I have lived already. Um, then the cold breath of fear reaches people, breathes on people of all ages, every walk of life. The wealthy fear the loss of their possessions. The destitute fear their inability to find a place to live and food to eat. Businessmen fear failure and bankruptcy. And it seems like everyone these days is afraid of the inflation that has already begun. But the most common fear today is fear of COVID. It pervades every aspect of life: school, business, government. It determines whether or not we gather in our homes with friends. I've seen people in their cars driving alone wearing a mask. Boggles my mind. There is absolutely no protection a mask can give you if you're in your car alone. I've seen runners running alone wearing a mask. Again, it boggles my mind. There is no protection you get from wearing a mask as you're running. Um, you may have read the story earlier this week of a woman on a Delta flight who had to be restrained and arrested because she was attacking a man who wasn't wearing his mask while he was eating. And there was a school where the teacher insisted the children wear their masks between bites. We've really arrived at the point of crazy. Well, Christians have been handicapped by fear. I know Christians who have not gone out in a year, have not left their homes in 1 year. Hard for me to believe. Normal people, it seems, but they won't leave their home or they won't leave their property. Several people have been in their homes for most of the last 2 years. They don't venture out because they're afraid of getting COVID. Others go out, but they avoid all gatherings with believers. Well, fear is a prison. The major motivation for doing these things has been the fear of sickness, in this case COVID, and the fear of death. Well, fear is a powerful motivator. It can drive us to action or it can paralyze us into inaction, but ultimately is a form of slavery that limits our actions. Hebrews 2 talks about it, and it talks about who the slaveholder is. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity. That is, Jesus shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death. That is the devil, the slave master, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. So for a Christian, we need have no fear of death. You might well fear the process of dying. What's it going to be like to die? Concerned about the pain and concerned about the challenges of it. But death, we know where we're going. It's only better. It is a passageway into something that is beyond the most wonderful things we have ever dreamt of. Paul says, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, nor has it entered into the heart of man all that God has prepared for those who love him. So there is no reason to fear death. And if you have no fear of death, then there really shouldn't be any fear in life that you should worry about. In the early church, martyrdom was common. So common, in fact, that the word martyrios, from which we get our word martyr, used to mean witness, just meant witness. That was it, somebody who gave a testimony. But so many people were put to death for giving their testimony about Jesus Christ that the word changed its meaning to mean somebody who dies giving their testimony. And when they died, you read the stories in Fox's Book of Martyrs, or you read it elsewhere, they sang hymns. They praised God. Can you imagine standing in the flames and singing hymns of praise to God? I want what they had. They were unafraid. This life is not all there is, but there is a tendency as Christians to somehow think that this is it. This is the best there is, and we need to stay here. Well, the testimony of history is this. The ultimate statistic is death. 1 out of 1 dies. We are going to die. We will leave this place. And so we need to choose whether we're going to be afraid or we are going to march boldly forward without fear. We are called to fear God rather than men. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, we read in Proverbs 1:7. Excuse me. The fear of man will prove to be a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is kept safe. And in Matthew 10:28, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. We are called to recognize that the only one to fear is God. But God is the one who has died in the form of Jesus Christ on the cross to save us. He is the one who defends us. He is the one who pleads his wounds before the Father. He is the one who has demonstrated his love in this, that while we were yet his enemies, he died for us. Fearing God, though, does not guarantee a long life. Certainly not a long life fighting Ebola in Uganda. Dr. Matthew Lukwaya, a Christian, was there fighting Ebola. He was a missionary. And his ministry as a doctor was to care for those who were dying of Ebola, where there was next to no cure at that time. Virtually no one recovered. A horrible disease. And when lab teams confirmed Ebola in Uganda, they went from hut to hut looking for sick people. And every newspaper, every radio station had advertisements telling people that Ebola had come. And the campaign worked, but it also caused mass panic. And sick and dying were taken to St. Mary's Hospital, which is where Dr. Lukaya worked. He led the medical group there. He cared for the Ebola patients in the isolation ward. They paid a lot of money, and he could have made much more in the United Kingdom. He had many job offers from the UK. He was an extremely competent doctor, but he opted instead for a low-paying job and risking his life daily caring for those that no one else cared for. Well, when rebels came to the hospital in 1989 to kidnap some of the nuns, Dr. Matthew instead, who was an evangelical Protestant, offered himself as a hostage. He persuaded them to take him instead. And a month later, they released him. But he had no way of knowing he would ever be released. He expected to die. Well, he may have escaped the kidnappers, but he did not escape Ebola. One day, he was there sleeping in the room adjacent to one of the patients, and the patient stood up, near death, big man, and ripped out the tubes that he had holding him down, and started running through the ward. And Dr. Matthew put on his protective garb, but didn't have time to put on his face shield. And he went over and he tackled the man and he got him back into bed. Now that man died not that long afterwards, but he was alive long enough to infect Dr. Matthew. And several weeks later, after intense suffering, Dr. Matthew Lukaya died. A relatively young man. The entire story was told in a New York Times article. The gospel was shared clearly in the New York Times. The life of a man in Africa undoubtedly has been responsible for people coming to the Lord around the world as they read that article. A good man, willing to go unafraid, no fear even of Ebola. And yet we fear COVID. We fear so many other things. Now, Jesus lays out the project goals for a Christian. Here are the things we're supposed to do while we're here. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his throne, on his glorious throne. Matthew 35. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right, the goats on his left. Notice that he has both sheep and goats in the church, those who are truly believers and those who are not, together in the church until the end. And then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" And the king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." They will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. So it's quite interesting that what this passage is indicating is that the faith that we have is manifest in the actions that we take, not at church, not even in a church setting, but in the real world, in the highways and byways, as we encounter people who have needs. Whether those needs for food, needs for comfort, needs for money, whatever those needs may be. We are called to sacrificially care for others. Whatsoever you did for the least of these, my brethren, you did for me. In other words, Jesus is not physically here. He is in heaven. So how can we serve him? We dedicate ourselves when we come to Christ to serving Jesus, but he's not here. And so he leaves his representatives. And his representatives, he says in Matthew, his representatives are the poor. His representatives are those who are going through struggles, those who are lonely, those who are in prison, those who are facing hardship. And whatsoever we have done for them, we have done for him. Greater love than this has no man, we're told, but to lay down his life for his friends. And so ultimately, the opportunity that Jesus lays out for us is that we might actually serve him as we physically serve someone else. Now, this was very interesting. I was reading this about Sister Teresa, about Mother Teresa, an Albanian woman who became a nun, a Catholic nun in India. And she spent the years from 1929 until 1997, so almost 7 decades. She worked amongst the poor and the sick in the really filthy slums of Calcutta. Now, I've been to India well over 30 times. I had not been to Calcutta. I've seen sections of India that were horribly filthy. I've seen others that were very nice. But I had been told that Calcutta was pretty bad. And the sections where she worked, pretty bad. Well, one day a man walked up to Mother Teresa, right after he had seen her hugging a leper. And he said, "Man, I wouldn't do that for all the money in the world." And she answered him and she said, "Neither would I. I'm doing it for the love of Jesus." And that is what compels us to care for others. And she had said on another occasion that when she hugs a leper, or when she hugged a little baby who was dying, she saw in that baby and she saw in that leper that she was hugging Jesus, and that they were his representatives here. And from a theological standpoint, she is completely right. But even more, from a practical ministry standpoint, that is what we are called to do, to care for those that nobody else cares about. Jesus associates himself with the sinners, with the sick, with those who are struggling. Well, how does God judge value? This was another interesting quote from Mother Teresa. At the end of life, we will not be judged by how many diplomas we have received, how much money we have made, how many great things we have done. We will be judged by this: I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was homeless, and you took me in. But fear keeps us from service to Jesus. There are mass fights at the supermarket. Hard to imagine. Vaccine shaming. Others just isolate themselves and lock themselves off from the world, and they quarantine themselves, many times quarantining themselves from the well. Well, why is COVID different from any other disease? Historically, Christians have sought to help those who had diseases, even risking their own lives, whether it was the plague, whether it was smallpox, whether it was any number of other things. Ebola. Well, many Christians are far more afraid of this disease than of any other. Well, fear doesn't come from God. For this reason, Paul writes to Timothy, guided by the Holy Spirit, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. Notice this. For the Spirit of God does not make us timid, doesn't make us cowards, but it gives us power, love, and self-discipline. So do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord or of me, his prisoner. Rather, join with me in suffering for the gospel by the power of God. Fear is a great sin. Revelation 21, it uses the word cowardly, but it's the same word as back in Timothy, timidity, fear. It says, those who are victorious will inherit all this. I will be their God. They will be my children. But the cowardly, that is the fearful, the unbelieving, the vile. Notice he puts fearful and unbelieving together because fear is associated with lack of faith. Fearful, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. Christians are historically fearless. They've historically been fearless. You go back through the plagues. In 165 AD, there was a plague known as the Antonine Plague. It was spread from the Huns to the Germans and throughout the Roman Empire, and it killed between a quarter and 1/3 of the population. What we have with COVID is nothing compared to that. A little less than a century later, in 250 AD, the Cyprian plague hit Rome, and it was believed that at its peak, almost 5,000 people a day were dying from the disease. Well, during these many other times throughout human history, the church was faced with a decision that we as Christians face today. How do we love God and love our neighbor in the place, time, and circumstance where we find ourselves? Corrie ten Boom, I'm sure you remember her. Perhaps you've read her book, The Hiding Place. She, her sister Betsy, and her father hid Jews in World War II Holland. And you recall how they wound up ultimately being captured, taken into one of the camps, actually moved through a couple of the camps, and they had been hiding 6 Jews when they were arrested. Everyone in the house got arrested. There were about 30 people in the ten Boom family home that day, and all but 3 were released. Betsy, her sister Corrie, and their father. Betsy and their father died in prison. Corrie lived to tell the story of what they went through and the incredible suffering, all for helping some people. They were unafraid, and they went forward. And what a ministry she had. If you never heard her speak while she was alive, you missed just a wonderful, wonderful testimony. Well, during the Antonine Plague, Christians stepped in to serve those in need at great risk to themselves. When the Cyprian Plague later hit Rome, most of the population fled in an effort to distance themselves from the disease. Christians instead stepped out in faith to care for those in distress. And instead of fear and despondency, the earliest Christians would stay and they tended to the sick and the dying. They knew full well that it would likely result in their own deaths. They showed works of unreasonable sacrificial mercy, and this completely dumbfounded the pagans, and there were a great many who became followers of Christ as a result. In Rome, the Christians buried not just their own, but they buried the pagans who had died without funds for a proper burial. They also supplied food for thousands of people on a daily basis. Christians stepped in when others fled. During the plague in Alexandria in the 1300s, when nearly everyone else fled the city to escape that disease, the early Christians risked their lives for one another. Simple deeds, washing the sick, offering water and food, consoling the dying. At the risk of their own lives, they saved an immense number of lives. Their even basic amounts of nursing and care greatly reduced mortality. Simply by providing food and water to the sick, who were temporarily too weak to cope for themselves, they enabled them to recover instead of dying a miserable death. Everyone who could was running from the plague except for this one group. Instead of running from the plague, they ran to it, and that is the Christians who were moved by this death defying compassion, the love of Jesus. Now, we have the testimony of a historian who wrote about Christians in the plague. His name was Eusebius. He was a bishop and a historian of the early church. And he said this, quote, "All day long, some of them, that is the Christians, tended to the dying and to their burial, countless numbers with no one to care for them. Others gathered together from all parts of the city, a multitude of those withered from famine, and they distributed bread to them all." Martin Luther spoke some years later about how Christians should respond to the plague. When the bubonic plague came back to Germany in 1527, his hometown of Wittenberg was greatly affected. And in response, he wrote a letter to his friend, and in the letter he entitled it, "Whether One Should Flee from a Deadly Plague." And here's what he wrote: "I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed in order not to become contaminated and thus perchance inflict and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. If God should wish to take me, he will surely find me, and I have done what he has expected of me, and so I am not responsible for either my own death or the death of others. If my neighbor needs me, however, I shall not avoid place or person, but will go freely as stated above. See this as such a God-fearing faith because it is neither brash nor foolhardy and does not tempt God." Christians in times of sickness and persecution, we read about 165 AD, 250 AD, the 1300s, 1527, where people were fleeing from one another not because that was the most loving thing to do, but because they desired self-protection and self-preservation. They weren't social distancing out of love and sacrifice. They were doing so out of fear and selfishness. Luther's encouragement to us as Christians is to consider, as the early church did, what is the most loving response? When we're dealing with COVID, what is the most loving response? We learn in these moments to move towards those in need, not away from them. Even if we socially distance, we still consider how to love and care for those in the pandemic of our day, as we learn from the example of Christ followers who have come before us. God's command to Abraham is the same command to us. "Fear not. After these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward." And we even have earthly testimonies of the vapid nature of fear. We have nothing to fear except fear itself. Fear can paralyze you. Fear can keep you from doing things. Fear can cause you to think the most bizarre thoughts. But Roosevelt was speaking at the beginning of a war, and the last thing that was needed was for people to cower in fear. Likewise today, we have nothing to fear except fear itself. David Livingstone was a man who transformed the continent of Africa. He had hoped to go to China as a missionary, but then was told he was going to go to the West Indies instead. Well, as he was going through his studies, he met Robert Moffat, who recommended Africa. And he was excited about his vision of expanding missionary work there, but he also was excited about the prospect of abolishing the slave trade. Moffat believed that Christians could go there and convince people to stop selling slaves. When Livingstone questioned if he would go to Africa, he considered Moffat's words, and instead of going to an old mission, he felt that he would go to the vast plains to the north of Bechuanaland and to Botswana, where Moffat had glimpsed, he said, quote, "the smoke of 1,000 villages where no missionary had ever been," unquote. And so Livingstone set off in 1840, sailed on a sailing brig, and during the voyage he studied Dutch, and the Tasana language, the language of the people he was about to meet. And the captain gave him extensive training in navigation, which was helpful because he would wind up having to navigate his way back and forth, east to west and north to south in Africa. He was an abolitionist. The natives sought to kill him because they thought he was a slave trader. He was white. They thought he was a Muslim and that he was there to trade them to others. And then the Muslims sought to kill him because he ended their slave trade wherever he went. So he didn't have a lot of friends wherever he went. He had to create friendships and convince people to trust him. And then he completely lost contact with the outside world for 6 years. And he was ill for much of the last 4 years of his life. Only one of 44 letters that he sent out made it as far as Zanzibar. One surviving letter to a man named Horace Waller was made available to the public in 2010 by its owner, and it reads, "I am terribly knocked up, but this is for your eye only. Doubtful if I live to see you again." I would say this too about David Livingstone. He went east to west across the continent of Africa and then north to south. And if seen from above the earth, David Livingstone, through his footsteps, made the sign of the cross on the continent of Africa. He died as he was praying. He was praying, kneeling down against his cot. And while he was there praying, he just stepped into the presence of God. Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, missionaries to the Auca Indians in Ecuador, a horrible group of Indians who were cannibals, who had killed a lot of people. Well, Jim was martyred alongside 4 other missionaries in 1956. After her husband's death, Elizabeth went to go live among the tribe that killed her husband. And she went there with their 3-year-old daughter. Now, you have to say, well, this woman was crazy. She had no fear. And she shared the truth of the gospel with them. And the very man who had killed her husband and the others became a follower of Jesus and has a wonderful, or had a wonderful testimony while he was alive. But Jim Elliot wrote this. He said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." He also said, "If we are the sheep of his pasture, remember that sheep are headed for the altar." Now, fear of God, I would suggest to you, leads to awakening. Here are the 5 steps to an awakening. This is from a book called The Spiritual Awakeners by Keith Hardman. If you've never read it, I strongly recommend it to you. It tells the stories of awakenings over the past 2 millennia, with a special emphasis on the awakenings here in the United States. First, revival is usually preceded by a time of spiritual depression, apathy, and gross sin, in which the great majority of nominal Christians are hardly different in any substantive way from the members of secular society, and the churches are moribund. Okay, check. Second, an individual or a small group of God's people becomes conscious of its sins and backslidden condition and vows to forsake all that is displeasing to God. People recall past outpourings of God's grace and power and long for them to be manifest again. People all over the world begin independently praying for such revivals. It is my belief that is happening today. Check. Third, as occasional Christians begin to yearn for a manifestation of God's power, one or more leaders arise with prophetic insights into the causes and remedies of the problems. A new revelation of the people and pure character of the Lord is given. This standard of holiness exposes the degeneracy of the age and stimulates a striving after holiness by God's people. That may be the step that we are awaiting right now. Fourth, the awakening of Christians occurs. An understanding and an appropriation for the higher spiritual life is made possible for many. The evangelism of the unsaved may or may not be concurrent with this renewal of Christians. In the great revival of the Reformation, The bringing of salvation to those outside the church was not a paramount issue, whereas the dissemination of Scripture doctrine was. Fifth, the awakening may be God's preparation to strengthen his people for future challenges or trials. Throughout church history, renewal has often been antecedent to persecution and severe tests, as yet unseen, that were to come and winnow God's people. Yeah, there is a lot to fear, but I think that there is an awful lot more to embrace and to hope for. And I believe that we live at exactly the time that God wants us to live, and that the opportunities that we have are amongst the greatest in the history of the world. And so I would suggest to you, 2022, what an invigorating and wonderful time to be alive.